Cool. Wayne, do you have any specific questions that I can answer for you or try to?
No, I didn't see on there. What was it? This meeting supposed to be related to? Is
Just
there
tech time.
topic?
Yeah, so
Pardon?
it's just tech time. It's pretty much an open forum for you guys. I'll come with some topics typically to talk about, but generally it's just to answer questions that you guys run into out in the field.
Oh, no. I mean, I don't know everything, but I haven't had anything that stumped me per se. You know,
Yeah, no worries.
the only thing I think of occasionally, not that we get it often, is better training in tech, how to even to look for and access if somebody could even add a zoning system. And or some of the other guys use them. Would you ever get into even those vent boosters? You know, when you got a room that's a little flat, what the requirements are, what we look for, how to access, you know, stuff like that down the road.
Sure.
I mean, well, again, it doesn't come up. It's not a regular basis by any means.
Yeah. From my understanding of those vent boosters, they generally don't have a good end result typically. Okay, once in a while, people will get an advantage out of them, but one of the biggest things with them. Let me go ahead and kick this one. I got it here. Give me a second. Yeah, so one of the key things with the booster fan concept is, you know, it's supposed to help grab some of that air from a long run or an end run and get more of that conditioned air into the space. Well, the problem with it is with modern technology. So in the old days, with a standard blower motor, it's just going to run. You know, a permanent split capacitor motor, it's just going to run and do whatever it can. If you go ahead and help it, it says, okay, great, it got the help. Now with a variable speed motor, or I shouldn't say variable speed, with any electrically commutated or ECM motor, they're going to compensate or they're going to adjust based on how hard they're having to work. So when you put a booster fan into a system like that, it essentially tells that fan, I don't have to work as hard, slow down. So it can make the problem worse in my understanding and my experience with them. Okay.
Right.
The other key thing then is obviously you have to have power supply there in order to power the fan, you know, and then it has to be interfaced into the system in some way. I have seen where they work, but more often they don't work is what I would say.
Oh, so they get interfaced in. It's not like a small thermostat on there or any that activates it.
Well, they could. I mean, they could be switched by temperature, rise or drop, but also it could be a sail switch where it senses the airflow and then it turns on maybe. But generally, it's going to be a wired interface where it's going to have to say, okay, the fan's running, so I need to run now too.
Sure. Yeah. But I don't bring them up. I just know a couple guys that use them somehow before. I think a Jim had somebody do it once.
Yeah, so not a lot of success.
Right.
The thing that I always recommend to folks when people have those problems where they have a specific room that's a problem, I mean, there's multiple ways to deal with it, right? So you mentioned it before. The very best way, though, to deal with stratification or temperature differences to split the system and have two different systems. And then you can really get great control. You have the two systems, so you can, you know, condition one part of the house but not the other, and that whole thing. And that's absolutely the gold standard. The best way to control any multi-story home should always have two systems, in my perspective. The second best then is zoning. Now, zoning works. It works best when the system is designed for it or when it's conducive to using it, and then when it's properly installed and designed. Some of that is hindered by accessibility. How much can we get to? How much of the ductwork can we actually see? You know, if you have a huge unfinished basement and the majority of the ductwork is right there for us, we can usually design something that's going to work pretty well. But that takes a little bit of fudging. The next down the line, then the next thing that I recommend to folks is balancing the system. So most homes have balancing dampers on each run, each supply run, and again, it needs to be done with thought in mind, with intention, and you have to read the static pressure in order to not overdo it. So, you know, I've run into customers, and I'm sure you guys have heard this too, but where people will say, "Oh, it never gets cool enough on the top floor, so I close all the vents on the main floor," right? So that's not helping usually. It doesn't, and they say, "Well, yeah, it still doesn't work," right? So it's not an advantage, and it doesn't usually help. It usually just is a bad situation when they do that. So closing those partially, the dampers at the trunk line is really where they're going to get the best effect. If they close the register damper, you tend to get noise and things like that, and it really doesn't work as well. So actually balancing them from the trunk line is going to be the way that they'll get the best advantage. And then of course, sealing that ductwork is of an advantage too, to get the air where it's supposed to go. That's kind of the cascade of best ways to do this. Personally, I've never had anybody accept splitting the system and going to two systems because it's very, very costly. I mean, you're talking, probably $50,000-$60,000 or better to add
All
that
right.
second system, to put a smaller system on the main floor, to split the ductwork and all this stuff. I mean, it'd be huge, a huge project. So if somebody's absolutely going to stay in their home for a long time, then it might be worth it to them. But I haven't run into them yet. More often, it's either been a zoning or balancing, and then maybe some AeroSeal or something like that to kind of get it into a better place.
Right. Okay. And
Um,
that's just like anything, AeroSeal, you just never want to overpromise because we have no idea how, if anything, will improve,
That's right. Yeah, I mean, we do guarantee it. So if it doesn't improve, we don't charge them for it, but, and truthfully, full transparency at this point, we had our AeroSeal equipment at the 216 building that's being renovated now, and it's a little MIA. We're not able to find it right now. So,
Oh, no.
yeah, I'm not thrilled about that. You don't know where it's at, do you, Wayne?
No, I do not.
Well, yeah, I'm hoping it'll turn up at some point, but when things got moved out of that building for the reno, that's when it kind of went MIA. So we're gonna see what we can do about finding it, but either way. So that's kind of the rundown. Any questions come up from that conversation regarding the zoning thing? All right. Okay, cool. So I know there's been some questions about boilers. I thought I would just give a little bit of a basic primer on boilers here for everybody. You can see my screen there now. Looks like it's sharing now. So this is essentially a basic boiler diagram. I think if I scroll over it, yeah, it tends to gray it out. So whatever. So there's a couple things that you can look for in general on boilers. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that we do not work on and install steam boilers. We've done them. We don't do them. That it's a skill set that our technicians generally don't have, and they're dying out. There's very few steam boilers out there. So the question often comes is, how do I identify a steam boiler? How do I know when it's steam versus hot water? So I'm curious, anybody here in the room, does anybody know that? What are some of the things we'd look for? And it might tell us that it's steam as opposed to hot water.
It's got to be a secondary source that creates the steam, I would imagine.
No, so it's a similar boiler, and they can look very much the same. And in fact, some boilers are capable of being either steam or hot water. Some boilers can do both, right?
Well,
Mhm.
I think, Eric, the steam boilers, they look like the old radiators for one, but I think they also have a relief valve on them, don't they?
Well, there's going to be pressure relief valves on any boiler, okay? But what you're going to see is a blowdown valve, is what they call it. It's a device that's used to kind of wash out the sediment. It's a catch for the sediment. You want to make sure that the water is really clean in one of these. But the other couple of things that you'll see is on a standard water boiler, a hot water boiler, there's almost always going to be a circulating pump, okay? In the olden days, and there could still be some very old ones that are still gravity, meaning they just use the convection of the hot water, it rises up and then it cools and comes back down. Very inefficient, very poor way to do it. They may still be out there in their antiquated form, but almost all hot water boilers use a circulating pump. So when you see a pump on there, it's almost never going to be a steam boiler. So that's one indication. If you see a pump on there, it's telling you that it is almost certainly hot water. Okay. The second thing is, I'm going to bring up another image here for you guys to see. Okay. Whoops. There we go. All right, so this is one of the things that I always used as a technician to see right away. It's just coming up on your screen now. So this is a sight glass, and this will be exclusively on steam boilers. So it's going to be on the side, and as you can see, there's two pipes that come in and out at high upper and lower levels, and then essentially a sight glass here that just fills up with water, and it indicates how full the boiler is. Okay. So steam boilers have to maintain a certain level of water in there. And essentially it's just boiling that water. The steam goes up and goes through the system, cools back and condenses into water, and then runs back to the system. So the way that they're piped has a real important part in this. The size of the piping, the type of radiators, as Randy mentioned, is one indicator, But what I'll tell you is I've seen plenty of radiators that could be both steam or hot water. But the key thing is if there's only one pipe going into it, again, only one pipe going into the radiator, then it's likely steam. Hot water is going to have a supply and a return. It's always going to have that return pipe. With steam, the steam goes up and then the water runs in the bottom part of the pipe and makes its way back down. So steam boilers, there are fewer and fewer of them around right now, but they are out there for sure.
Hey, Eric.
Yeah.
Where's that located on that boiler? And is that in the back and the rear part of it?
You know, Regis, there's a lot of variation and they could be in different places. So they're going to be on the side. If you see the blue part here, that's the cover. Essentially, that's the tin cover around the boiler. And it's just going to be somewhere near the bottom part of the boiler. It could be on the back or the side. It would be hard to say for sure where it would be. Okay. So the homeowner might know if it's steam or not. But the sight glass is going to be one of the key things. And then also that blow down valve and then no circulating pump. And then the other key one is much larger piping. Usually steam boilers are going to have a really huge supply piping. So what we can see sometimes and oftentimes in older homes and things, older buildings, it was originally steam and then it was converted to hot water. So it could have the same large piping and the same radiators, but they've been converted for hot water. Okay. Any questions there? I'm going to switch back to that other diagram here in a moment. Go over some more of that with you. Yeah. Yep. I think I got to go back here. Hold on. All right, I'm going to bring my diagram back up here. Okay, you guys should see this in just a minute. So I'll tell you, for me, from my personal perspective, when I got into this business, 20 years ago, I like to know stuff and I wanted to know everything I could. And then when I went out to jobs on regular forced air stuff and air conditioners, and I was trying to figure it out, it was very frustrating for me. When I did figure it out and started feeling pretty comfortable and good at it, I thought, this is great. I know this stuff now. I know what to do. Well, then I'd get sent to a boiler and my head would just spin. And this is a super simplified way of looking at it. Sometimes it's a big tangled mess. There's pipes all over the place. There's all kinds of wires and it gets really confusing. It can be very confusing. But the logic that I applied to it was, again, something I learned in service as far as looking at wiring schematics. A wiring diagram can look super confusing when you look at it as a whole. But when you break it down to its parts and you look at the low voltage side versus the high voltage side, that kind of simplifies things. And then you can look at certain circuits and you can really help your mind, or at least for me, it worked to simplify it in my mind and made it easier to look at. But the reason I'm saying this is a boiler is really no different than that wiring schematic. It's a piping schematic, essentially, right? So one of the things that you're going to look for and see is at the very top here, where you see where it says fill valve and backflow preventer. That's also referred to as a reducing valve. The reducing valve is the technical correct term for it. And essentially what that does is it takes your incoming water pressure, which is usually around 20 to 30 PSI, and it reduces it down to what the boiler wants. And I believe it's 12 PSI is what it brings to. So what happens then is when the boiler is cool, when the water is cool, it shrinks. It takes up less space. That heating and cooling, expanding and contracting. So it shrinks down, it takes up less space. If any water needs to be added, then the fill valve is going to bring that boiler back up to 12 PSI. When the boiler actually fires and starts running, it's going to run up into around 20 PSI or so, 18, 20, or maybe 25 PSI. So then at that point, then it's not going to add any water until it cools back down. But some of the keys here then is if you follow that water line, that the water line is going to come off of near the water heater sometimes, or you're going to be able to see that it's an actual water supply line and not a boiler pipeline. So it's going to come in, and when it's done properly, what we see here is a proper setup. Now, what's important to remember is all this stuff around here is called trim. All the extra parts that are connected to a boiler is referred to as trim. There's the exact textbook way it should be done, and then there's some variations to that, and then there's some stuff that looks really messed up that does still work sometimes that people have done over the years. So that's where it can get a little tough to kind of understand what's going on, because it can be done, these things can be done in a lot of different ways. But this is really the right way here. So thinking about the pipe that comes in, the main pipes that go in and out of the boiler, the return pipe is going to be at the bottom, right? So you're going to put that colder water, and we say colder, but it's not cold per se. but the coldest water is going to go into the bottom of the boiler, it's going to heat up, and then it's going to be pulled out at the top of the water jacket here. So the higher pipe is typically going to be the supply side. Okay. Most people do like to have the circulator on the supply side, right? You like to push the water through the system rather than pulling it back. Again, there's some debate there. Some people say it's better to have it on the cooler side. The pump lasts longer, blah, blah, blah. I don't know, but I see them on the supply side most often. So your water supply comes in at the very top of the screen there where you see fill valve, and that pipe takes a turn and it goes directly into the air vent. Now that's the best way to pipe it in my perspective. When you have an air eliminator, it's there to pull the air out of the water, and it's a really important part of a boiler system. What happens though is when you put water into a boiler, the water that we get for our tap is aerated. It's got air in there. There's an aerator on the sink. There's air in there, and generally there's air entrained in the system. The water in a boiler, we really want that to be dead water. We want there to be no air in that water whatsoever. And the value there is that when there is no air, it slows corrosion. So the internal parts of the boiler and the radiators and the piping and everything's going to last longer when we've eliminated the air from that system. When air continually gets reintroduced, higher potential for corrosion and breaking down of those parts over time. So our goal is then to fill the water. When the water goes in, it should go in at the vent, so it picks off some of that air to begin with. And then as the boiler continues to run, it's going to pull more and more of that air out of there. Okay. So then underneath that air vent, you can see that tank, and that's an expansion tank. And what I talked about before, when the water cools, it shrinks. That expansion tank has a diaphragm in the bottom of it, a rubber diaphragm that's charged to 12 psi, and it makes its way up. It pushes that water as it shrinks to make sure that no air accumulates in there. When the water heats up, it pushes that diaphragm back down as it expands. So essentially, it's an adjustment that'll help make sure that that water stays completely full and that air doesn't get reintroduced into the system. So that's a lot. Any questions on what I've talked about so far? Okay. So Randy mentioned a pressure relief valve, or Wayne or one of you guys did. Now that's going to be present on any boiler. It's a safety device, and it's going to be there on a water heater. It's going to be there on a boiler as well. And if you see below the diaphragm expansion tank is labeled pressure relief valve. So it's a small valve. It looks very much like a pressure relief valve on a water heater, except there's a key difference there. On a water heater, it's a T&P valve, meaning temperature and pressure relief valve. So the one on a water heater will open if it gets too hot, and it will also open if it gets too high in pressure. On a boiler, it's not temperature controlled. You can get the water as hot as you want, basically. You know, and in some boilers, it runs up close to boiling, up into the 200-degree level. So, but it will release on pressure, and they're, from my memory, they're 30 psi is what they're set at. So if that pressure relief valve is popping off, and you can see that because there'll be evidence of water dripping down on the floor, corrosion, mineral buildup, that kind of thing, oftentimes that means there's a problem in that fill system. Either the diaphragm expansion tank has failed, so it fills it up, and then there's nowhere for it to go when it warms up. It overpressures and it pushes out of that relief valve. There could be multiple reasons, but the diaphragm failure is a common one. So what you see there then is a diaphragm expansion tank. And that is the modern way of handling that expansion. The other way that you're going to see that's not shown here is called a compression tank. And this is a large tank. It's a big cylinder that's usually up in the floor joists of the building that the boiler is in. So it's above you. And the piping goes up to that. And the way that works is essentially just by gravity. The air goes up and it gets trapped into that tank. And it maintains some air, and that's the cushion. The air that's in that tank up high is the cushion for the expansion that's going to occur when the water heats up or cools down. Okay. So there's a couple other things that we see here. It does show a pressure gauge on the boiler. Sometimes there are pressure gauges, sometimes there are not. My experience is most of the time they don't work after a fairly short time. The exception is those ancient ones. You'll see 70-year-old ones, 60-year-old ones, 50-year-old ones that still work just perfectly fine. So I'm making a case for the elderly here, guys. That's all of us.
Yeah, they don't make anything like they used to.
That's right. Not as good as it used to be, right? So those pressure gauges, you know, they may or may not work. I don't trust them typically as a technician, and in my service bag still, I have a gauge that I can screw on. So there's a boiler drain on these. You can see the drain valve on the backside of that lower piping, and it's got a threaded hose bib on it, just like a hose silcock on your home. but I have that kind of fitting on my pressure gauge and I can screw it on and I've got a gauge that I know I can trust, and then I can check the pressure in the boiler. So that allows me to diagnose and find out why it might be dripping out of the pressure relief valve. So one of the other things that you're seeing here then is that bypass. So if you see up on the top where it says circulator, the pump, to the left of that, it says optional bypass. Does anybody know why you might need a bypass, or why you might want a bypass?
Supply gets too great and goes back.
Somewhat. So here's what happens. I talked about converting steam systems to hot water systems. They have very, very large pipes. The header pipes, the main supply pipes are big. And in some cases, they can be 6 inches, 4 inches. I mean, monstrous. You know, you've seen these houses, you know, really big piping. So what will happen then is when the boiler fires up, it gets all this water nice and hot, 165 degrees or more, and then it pushes it out into that system. It's going to take a while to warm all that volume of water that's in all of those big header pipes, also in all the radiators. So you're pushing really hot water up there. You've got a really hot water jacket, and now that water's coming back pretty cold back into the boiler, and that can shock the boiler. So you can, in a worst case scenario, you can crack a heat exchanger or a heat jacket in a boiler. The other thing that can happen is the boiler will soot up. It'll get sooty because it doesn't maintain the right mixture of fuel and air when it's hitting that really cold block too much. So they'll get dirty and black and sooty in there. So what they do then is they'll do a bypass where it lets some of that hot water bleed back into the return to heat it up so it stays warm. Okay? So that's a not super common, but you do see that. You'll see that bypass or that recirculating thing. So to the left of that, then they have this indication there says strainer location. Now they don't really show it to us, but it's on the return. A strainer is a really good device to put on there, and essentially it's just what it sounds like. It's a trap that catches particles and debris and stuff that could be in the water, most commonly because things are corroding inside there, right? When air gets trapped and things corrode, then little particles break off, and you don't want those to get into the boiler or into the pump and that kind of thing. So a strainer will help to catch some of those. That's a really great accessory, good part of the trim to have. Now, looking at valves, you can see you've got a combination of both types of valves there. Closer to the boiler, I see ball style valves, like right next to the right of the diaphragm expansion tank. There's a ball style valve, but then there's gate valves that are up there as well. So gate valves, you know, oftentimes will fail. They're not as durable typically from the long-term perspective as a ball valve, and they're not as positive as far as shutting off as a ball valve would be. So isolation valves and knowing what kind of isolation valves are available to us to do the work has a lot of, it's an important factor to consider with boilers, because that can have a huge impact on how quickly the job can go. If there are really well-designed or well thought out isolation valves that work fine, the guys can shut those things off, do all their work, and then refill just that little bit of piping near the boiler, and it's back up and going. Now, secondly, if you have to drain down a whole house, it can be very challenging to re-purge or to refill a whole house piping system. And I personally have been on jobs where, you know, we spent a day, you know, struggling with it, trying to get it to purge. And it can be tough. There's tricks that you can use and things like that. But having more of those isolation valves and more valves that are viable and usable, that's going to be really a big advantage to our installers when they go to do that work. So one of the other important things, the challenges that we run into with boilers, I should say, that's fairly common, is the flue termination. So where the exhaust pipe is going to connect inside the house, from the boiler inside to wherever it goes out of the house. And in some cases, that termination is so low that we can't hook a proper exhaust pipe up to the boiler to connect to that flue connection. So they use on boilers, and any of you who have looked at them, use a barometric damper type of thing, or an atmospheric damper, I should say, on the boiler. Let's go ahead and find one of those. I'll come pretty good here in a second. All right. All right, so here, let's go up in a second. All right, you should be able to see my screen now. So this is a basic boiler, you know, a basic gas-fired boiler. So this is called an atmospheric damper right here, this upper part. So that's open underneath to let air get drawn in there. And there is a damper up here that opens and closes every time the boiler stops firing. So what this does is it helps to trap some of that heat in there. If that wasn't there, when the boiler stops firing, it's going to lose a lot of heat out that flue pipe and lose efficiency. So they'll oftentimes put one of these dampers on here. They come with it to get to the efficiency that they need to be. The point that I wanted to make here, though, is this distance between the top of the boiler where this pipe connects and the bottom of this atmospheric damper bell, that's fixed. And it'll say right on the pipe, do not cut, can't trim it, it must remain, blah, blah, blah. You can't change that. So the problem occurs then if that outlet or that connection place is too low and this new boiler is taller than the old one, now they're going to have a problem getting that pipe to connect. So it's really important to know that margin. What is the distance from the floor to that flue connection that we need to hook up to? And is the new boiler going to be compatible with that or not? And then the second thing that's critical in that as well is knowing the diameter of that pipe that they have to connect to. Because that's one of those things that can cause them to have to go chasing parts if they get out there. And it's and there's some weird ones, you know, there's 7-inch, there's 9-inch, you know, if it's some weird size, they need to have the proper adapter that'll connect it to the piping that they're going to be using for the device itself. All right, so that was a lot there. What questions do you have for me?
Well, not doing a lot of furnaces, boilers, like furnaces, all the old ones were much bigger, obviously, than the newer stuff. Is that the same thing with boilers, or are they pretty much the same height?
So it's going to vary, Wayne. Sometimes they're taller, you know, and some modern boilers are taller than some older boilers. There's some old funky old designs that are different, you know, and it varies a lot. And it's best to get some advice from one of the install managers. I'm sorry, not the service, but some of the install managers in particular, or one of the installers with boiler experience. Because in some cases, what they can do is reposition. They can open up a flue pipe up higher or something like that. But sometimes they can't, you know, and we don't want to get caught into that bind. That can really put us into a bind, and it can really back us up a bunch. So thinking back then, when you talk about old boilers, one of the most common things with boilers is oversizing. They oversize the shit out of boilers. It's real common, very common. And in a limited way, it doesn't cause too much problem, except it's less efficient and it costs them more for the bigger boiler that they're not even able to use. When it gets to an extreme, though, it'll do that sooting thing that I talked about previously when I talked about that bypass. So the boiler will soot up if it's way oversized. So what this really comes down to is when we talk about, like with a forced air system, we have to know the duct capacity to determine if it can handle the air conditioner and or the furnace that we want to put into that system or put into that home. With boilers, you can oversize and it'll still work. Eventually, though, you'll have problems. But the reality is all that extra doesn't go anywhere. So there are simple calculations that can be used. There's a bunch of different resources online for it, but you can go around and you can calculate the output capacity of the radiators that are existing, and anything beyond that is just wasted. There's no more energy that can come out of those other than what you're calculating there from that perspective. So one of the other kind of rules of thumb with boilers is they definitely work best, and it's a best practice if all the radiators on the boiler are the same, meaning they're all the same style, they're all the same size, they're going to work best that way. When you have a mix of, say, cast iron baseboard and copper fin baseboard and maybe some old stand-up sectional style radiators, it can be challenging to balance out a home like that. They always work best when there's consistent same type of radiators and same size of radiators throughout the home. And it can get super complicated, believe me. I'm not going to go too deep into all this, but you know, if you have, you know, a mixture, in some cases you'll see it where there'll be standard radiators and then there'll be some in-floor heating. Well, you have to temper that water down. You have to have mixing valves and all kinds of shenanigans to make it work properly in those cases. At its simplest form, boilers are very, very simple. They're an awesome way to heat a home. They're super comfortable, and truly they're very, very safe. You know, if you think about the risk in a forced air home, forced gas furnace home, is that if that heat exchanger fails, or when it fails, that pushes that exhaust up into the house. Where with a boiler, it's only down by the boiler itself. It's only moving water. So there's no I shouldn't say no, there's a much lower potential for it to push exhaust or carbon monoxide up into the home when you've got a boiler system. If any of you have lived in a home with hot water heat, it's a fantastic, super comfortable way to heat a home. Really nice. Okay. Any questions for me?
So the couple I've been on in the last 3 years or so, they seem to have some kind of a, I would call it like a zoning board, multiple valves.
Mhm.
Is that, no, I mean, they all have that. Is that one for each radiator, no matter what style it is?
Yeah, good question, Wayne. So that's zoning essentially is what that is. And not all boiler systems are zoned. When they are zoned, they can be zoned in different ways. So they can be pump zoned, meaning you have a separate pump for each part of the system that you want to use the heat or control. It's not usually radiator by radiator. It's usually going to be by the area, meaning one side of the house versus the other, or upstairs versus downstairs.
Mm.
But they'll essentially just have a separate pump for each part of that system. And when the thermostat calls for heat, it turns on the boiler, gets the water hot, and turns on the pump and circulates that water. So that's where that board you referred to, and those boards are usually Honeywell makes them. They're pretty common. They're pretty universal, and they can be used for different things in boiler zoning. So pump zoning is one way to do it. Typically more expensive. Multiple pumps gets more costly. Another one is you can do valve zoning, meaning you can have one pump and then you can have zone valves on the boiler that open and close the water flow essentially to specific areas. And that's where things can get a little complex. But again, it gives you that adaptability and that ability to even things out and make it super comfy.
So we would pretty much leave what they have. We wouldn't, if
Yeah,
somebody was smart enough to look at it and say, yeah, I want this zoning thing. I don't have it now.
Yeah.
Is that a big ordeal?
it varies a lot. It can vary a
Yeah.
lot, but it is absolutely important, as you said, Wayne, to stay with what they've got because that's what they're
Right.
used to, right?
Mhm.
And I've seen it too many times, unfortunately, where somebody has a zoning system on their conventional furnace, and they say, "Oh, I don't care about that. I don't want that." And the consultant, if they're not experienced enough, will go along with that and take it out for them. And then oftentimes they get pissed, and we end up having to go back there and put it back because they didn't realize how much they really count on it.
Yeah. Try not to recreate the wheel ever.
That's right. Yep. They got used to it and it works well. Now, if they tell you, it used to work, doesn't work anymore, or something like that, it's a different story, but it's not usually a good path to go down to take it out what they had. It's kind of like if they have a multi-stage furnace and you go ahead and sell them a single stage, they're going to notice the difference and they're not going to be happy with it.
Mm-hmm.
What other questions have you got for me, guys?
Don't know what to ask.
Okay.
On these.
Well, that's good stuff. So we got a little bit of a start there.
Yeah.
I absolutely encourage you guys to come with questions. If you can't make it here in person, then you can always email us the questions and we'll do our best to kind of go through them for you. Hopefully you picked up a little bit from some of this stuff. Please keep asking questions. I'm here for you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, guys, I'm gonna upload this video and it'll be available. So if you want to go back and review, or if anybody else has questions, dive in. Thank you all. Have a great one.
Have a good day.
Appreciate it. Thank you.